Beverly, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here, and thanks, Thea, for having me. What I'm going to be talking about today is how to optimize your healthcare user research from my learnings at GE Healthcare, and in particular, how we went about doing this in the COVID remote era. I'm currently the VP of UX at Allstate, have a team of about 100. And I started that role about a month ago. Before that, for 3.5 years, I was leading software UX for GE Healthcare. So this talk is about some of the learnings from that experience. So a little bit about me. I'm one of those magical unicorns roaming the universe, like many of us in UX. Started in tech about 25 years ago. I've done a lot of things. You can find me on LinkedIn easily. And more recently, I had a consultancy for about 10 years called Oxford Tech, where I was doing things like consulting for the state of California. I was also teaching analytics and UX at Columbia University and other places, as well as product management. And many people know me because of the UX Awards, which I founded and led until 2017. This was for many years this sort of premier awards for exceptional UX, and it was actually the first awards focused on UX before I went to GE. And at GE Healthcare, we have been gaining a lot of traction and publicity for the Edison Design System, which has already won 5 global awards. You can find it at edisondesignsystem.com if you want to check it out. It's a platform design system specific to healthcare, and it's much more than just colors and fonts, although it has that too. It's got plug-and-play code, it's got frameworks, it's got best practices. It's really a robust platform for healthcare optimization and standardization, with user research and testing being a foundational aspect of every part of it. And so we're really proud of that. And now I'm at Allstate, and it might seem a little strange, but there's actually some very interesting digital transformation efforts happening there. So a lot of learnings from GE Healthcare can be applied. So I thought I would start today's talk by actually covering some of the foundations of just how to optimize user research, period, let alone during COVID. And part of this talk was actually an evolution of an earlier talk I gave at CTO Summit last year, which was intended, as you can imagine, to reach CTOs, so engineering leaders who may not know much about UX research, let alone UX in general. And so for that audience, I was trying to explain the basics of what is UX research and how do you fit it into the software life cycle and how do you do it right. And the reality on it is, unfortunately, that some of those same messages could easily be beneficial to folks who are working in the industry as UX specialists, because a lot of times we really skew towards one style of research, leaving a lot of other tools in our toolkit that could have potentially been beneficial. So just a little bit of background. I'm sure everybody knows about Lean Startup. It came out now 12 plus years ago, and I used to say that Lean Startup was the best thing that ever happened to UX, because suddenly engineers and product managers were talking about this wonderful new idea that they could talk to customers and find out what they needed and build, measure, and learn and iterate on their products, and that they didn't have to go out and build something before finding out whether it worked or not. So the foundations of UX and even UX research were actually sort of a Trojan horse message hidden in Lean Startup that started to be shared with the industry. And at the same time, we had the rise of multivariate testing in a lot of different platforms like Optimizely for landing page design. And this is really actually a viable research method as well. It's just obviously you have to be at the right step of the process, and it has to be the right kind of product that can use this kind of approach. So there are challenges though with these this kind of model. And if we think about what this is actually saying with the build, measure, learn feedback loop, well, first off, how many of us work at companies where there's just loads of money to burn and armies of developers, ready and willing to build failed solutions? Probably not many of us. And that's really the inherent challenge, is that when you build first, then measure, then learn, you're obviously wasting a lot of time, money, and effort, up to 100x rework, according to IEEE, in terms of how you're going about your product release cycles. And this could be easily avoided by doing a little more upfront research and more robust omnibus research upfront. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir about this, but we'll get to the part that goes a little deeper. So there's also the challenge that if you're just focusing on analytics and that kind of testing at the end, you're going to miss, obviously, the signals that are telling you that you're solving for the wrong problem for the wrong audience. And then there's the added challenges of working in a highly regulated, high-stakes industry like healthcare or nuclear or aviation, the kind of products that GE sells, where the consequences can be very significant if the product was not accurately and adequately tested. So here's how to fix this model. We need to learn first, which of course is research, then validate, then build, and then measure. And there's user research at each step of the way to support these. And it is iterative. If you ask any user researcher, excuse me, every user researcher will tell you, oh yes, we need multiple different kinds of research methods. We need a holistic view in order to really understand our user. And that is accepted mantra in research, except for it isn't typically practiced. So the challenge is when you see the world as a hammer, i.e., most researchers really love to do that early discovery with user interviews and observational research, then the entire world, you're looking for nails, when in actual fact, you may need a wrench or other tools. And I'm not the only person, of course, to say that user research needs to take in multiple methods. It's common understanding within the UX community to do things this way. But the devil is in the details. So in a general sense, we can easily say that qualitative research will, in general, tell you what your user needs and goals are and solve for the user, while our quantitative methods will really be aligned to the business and organizational goals and will tell you if you were effective in your product. And the classic software development lifecycle approach that probably most of us are most familiar with and practice follows this sort of linear trajectory where we start with upfront discovery research early on, and then we move into evaluative research with user testing when we're near launching the product to make sure that our designs work or the product works. And then after it's launched, we get analytics coming back, which we're supposed to be analyzing for a virtuous circle. But the challenge is that this method is a little too simplistic. It doesn't give you the full aggregate picture. And even when we think about our design process, we basically follow a version of this. We're starting with lots of ideas, we're narrowing it down. In an ideal world, we're going to be doing quant and qual at each step of this process, just like we would in the software development lifecycle. So what is the ideal goal? The ideal goal, in my view, looks like this very simplistic matrix. On the left, you have qualitative and quantitative for the top and bottom. And at the top, you've got the software development lifecycle simplified from discovery to evaluative methods. And along the way, in a perfect world, you have both quant and qual at each step of the process. And the reason is because you're going to learn different things from different methods. And this is going to give you the most holistic view, not only upfront, but during the evaluative process and post-launch. And the upper left, which is what user researchers typically focus on, almost to exclusion, is what people believe or say they would do. That's what you're going to get from your interviews. That's what you're going to get from your discovery research. On the analytics side, when you look at what's coming back from logs or from performance data, you're going to get what people actually did, but of course you won't know why. There are those other quadrants that have deep insights in terms of why people do what they do, which is the upper right, as well as what people are likely to do pre-launch, especially. And these became very important in the COVID era to bring in methods that would capture some of that. So the classic example that I like to use is exercise. If you ask people how many times do they go to the gym, they're going to say, oh, I'm an animal. I go there 5 times a week and I bench press 100 pounds and I love it, right? That's the upper left. Then you put an Apple Watch on them and you find out that they're actually sitting in front of their TV all day, not doing what they said. But you don't know why. So the why turns out to be because it's COVID and they can't get to the gym and they have a 1-year-old newborn that they're taking care of that's keeping them up at night. And so all they're doing is mainly caring for their baby. Their gym answer was aspirational. The lower left quadrant shows the fact that you might get mixed messages, but you would start to get a sense that what they told you in the upper left wasn't fully accurate. There's actually, you start to see some doubt that would give you a little better picture of what was actually going on. So in an ideal world, you have a mixed approach that includes all of these things and includes some of these methods. I'm sure most of us are familiar with most or all of these methods and hopefully are practicing them. And you may quibble that with the idea that one of these methods is in a certain quadrant. Maybe you think it should be in a different quadrant, but you can humor me by looking at this now. And in the upper left, as I mentioned, that's really where user researchers tend to really gravitate, and they spend a lot of time there. This is kind of a mapping of what the quote unquote average user researcher actually does. They spend a lot of time in interviews and shadowing. They may do some user testing. As relevant, maybe they'd start to do some card sorts or task analysis, or if they're sophisticated, they'll look at some analytics data coming back or usage surveys, things like NPI, etc., and bring that in. But they're still leaving a lot of methods on the table. And that's where I think there's a real opportunity to optimize this model, and was necessary for us to optimize it at GE Healthcare because of COVID. So I'm going to take a step back and talk about how we did UX research at GE Healthcare pre-COVID and what kind of problems we were solving there. So when I joined GE Healthcare, not only is it a very engineering-centric organization that's highly focused on engineering quality and software delivery, it was an organization that didn't have that great of a UX sophistication, let alone user research. So we needed to do some foundational work to have folks understand what is the benefit of UX research and what's the benefit of UX overall, and how do you bring that into the software development lifecycle. So one of the examples, for example, of when we joined is a classic way that research, quote unquote, was being done is product managers were going to favored customers, existing customers of a product, and saying, hey, you told me you wanted this feature, well, I added it, what do you think? So of course, needless to say, this is a very biased method to get user feedback. It follows the lean startup model where you're asking your customers what they want, but the way it was executed was profoundly flawed. It wasn't at all objective. You had a lot of confirmation bias. And we know this, of course, in UX, but the point needed to be made to the organization that you actually need neutral researchers who are trained in this kind of stuff to go in and get the feedback and help to triage and evaluate upfront. Because otherwise, classic quote, I'm sure you've seen this 1,000 times, you're going to get the faster horses solutions and products coming out of this. So what did we do? Well, we first created a 10-step framework to describe how UX writ large should operate within the software development lifecycle as appropriate to GE Healthcare. And this was the kind of framework that, for example, a technical program manager could use as a checklist. They didn't have to necessarily understand UX to help follow along and make sure that the process was being followed. And the first thing was very simple. Did you even have UX staff on the product? Did you have sufficient people, both UX and researchers? Then did you define the basics of what your product was supposed to accomplish or your feature? So we had some kind of goalposts to work from before UX gets engaged. Then, of course, did we do that early discovery research to validate that this is a viable strategy and approach and feature that was necessary? Of course, we go into our UX ideation process. We come up with lots of ideas. We're going to iterate on those. We're going to have to get user feedback to help figure out which ones are the best. And then we narrow it down. We're going to deliver on time. We're going to use our design system for design consistency. And then we would release globally, which means we, of course, have to get multi-site global tests for our products and services, not just one site or one user or one customer. And then, of course, there's the validation process, and then we can look at what the data shows coming back. So this is an ideal world scenario of how to do UX mapped to GE and, a engineering-centric product release cycle. And the green here shows where's the role of research. And although research is heavy on number 3 and 5 and 8 and 10, there's actually research that is a foundational element of each of these steps. And so this is the sort of model that we went into COVID with and tried to practice. And you'll see with number 7, design system consistency, you might think, well, how is that really relevant to research? And actually, it was essential for optimizing our research and really helped save us in many ways. Because what was happening before we launched Edison Design System is that we would be testing a given healthcare product, and GE Healthcare has, dozens, if not hundreds of healthcare products, including, a couple dozen in the digital space where we work. And we would get feedback like, I can't read the text, or, it's too dark. Well, guess what? That wasn't about that product. That was about the fact that we lacked a tested, vetted, foundational design system that could be used across all the products. So by launching Edison Design System and making sure we had robust user research and testing for every aspect of those platform components, we took all of those kinds of feedback elements out because we had already tested and optimized at every nitty-gritty micro detail for the design system. And then when we were testing products, we could be focused on the product testing. Is it effective? Is it intuitive? Is it faster and easier to use than the prior, et cetera, for users? So some of the kinds of tests that we did for Edison Design System at the platform level included things like basic, accessibility testing, where we really went for AAA whenever possible for color contrast, to really looking at every little micro interaction and optimizing. So in this example, in GE Healthcare, we have a lot of medical imaging. You want to identify a lesion. Well, there's about 1,000 ways, maybe 1,000,000 ways you could do this. Does that line have a shadow? What's the color of the stroke? What's the color of the fill? Do we use a heat map? What's the z-axis? What's the style of the line? If it's dotted, what is the length of the each element, etc. So you could go on and on and on, noodling on the micro fine details of the design, and it makes a big difference when you're in healthcare because you're talking about, potentially identifying a cancerous lesion, for example, in an image. So you want to make sure you're getting it right. You're helping the radiologist to do their job in the fastest and most efficient and intuitive way without being obtrusive or too prescriptive, which could also be erroneous. So these kinds of details we would spend months iterating on and testing robustly the variations of how you might go about doing something as simple as this dotted line, which doesn't look very sophisticated, but actually had a lot of research behind it. And same thing with just something as simple as a toolbar, which you can find all of this at edisondesignsystem.com, and you'll find, one of these on edisondesignsystem.com is the final. But what you don't know is that there were dozens and dozens and dozens of variants of that toolbar that we tested for basic things like, could you read the disabled state? Was the pressed state too prominent compared to the others, etc.? Did users know which was pressed versus open? Again, a lot of testing that went into these platform elements that we were able to pull out of testing for individual products because now that was just baked into the system. Same thing for icons. This is something that we spent a lot of time testing. There's two different ways that we tested icons. For medical icons, you can imagine you might have an icon that represents a specific function in a piece of software, and that software is intended for a specific healthcare user, like a cardiac surgeon, right? Or a pediatric neurologist. So they're using a very specific kinds of piece of software that's specific to their medical specialty and context of use. It's not just like, a cog for settings, which you could ask any old Joe on the street if they know what that is. So you'd have to show them the icon in a relative context of use, make sure you were asking the appropriate persona that represented the target user of that medical software, and ensure that they understood what that icon represented, which is what we called metaphor testing. And then there was the issue of just simple distance. Does that icon scale from very small screens, like on an ambulatory product that you wheel around, to a large scale wall display, like in a command center? Does it work in all of those scenarios? So now we're coming to COVID. So we had this nice process. We had this whole approach that we're going to bring in different kinds of research and the 10-step process of how we go about it. And we've abstracted some of the research out because we have it covered in the design system. However, COVID comes along and poof, as we all know, the whole world goes into a real catastrophe, and bodies are piling up. The hospitals are overflowing. There's tent cities of people. And the last place on earth that we're going to be going to do user research and testing is going to be the hospitals, which is where we had done all of our user research and testing before. In addition, healthcare workers are overworked. The last thing that they're going to do when they're working a 23-hour day saving lives from COVID is talk to a GE healthcare researcher about a new feature in their product, or conversely, come on site to our sites to do testing. So, this threw a big monkey wrench into our testing process. And if we go back to all the different methods that we had at our disposal through this process, we then think about, of course, what UX researchers tend to like to do, which is the upper left, much more than any other quadrant. Then we think about all the things that we can't do now with COVID in a healthcare context because we literally can't access our target users because they're too busy and we can't, get on site with them. And you can see that we're really having a challenge. And then on top of that, you do the Venn diagram of what UX researchers typically did at GE Healthcare combined with ones that they could no longer do with COVID, and you were basically at a roadblock. Yes, you had a strategy and plan. You were going to release a certain feature, but guess what? You can't, because you can't do the research and you can't validate with the user. And in a healthcare context, you got the FDA, they want their formative and summative testing. You cannot release that product unless you've got the testing. So our releases stop. Well, that's obviously a major problem for the organization. So what did we do about it? We weren't able to do things in the way that we had historically. So one of the ways that we ended up solving for this was, in effect, turbocharged surveys, as well as a heavy pivot to remote method testing. And yes, we still had to do some on-site for last mile, but we tried to do as much as possible upfront using remote methods, and especially surveys, which historically researchers hate surveys. They think it's, they don't like creating them. And the reason is because typically surveys haven't really been optimized to gain the full benefit of what a survey can give you. A survey can be whatever you want it to be. You just have to invest the time and effort to optimize the survey in the appropriate way, and that's usually where they fall down. So I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes about a sample survey that we had there. All of the questions are abstracted, so they won't represent how we actually ask the user, because I can't show you, those concepts, but I'm showing the kinds of questions that we asked and the kind of approaches that we took. One example here was a survey we called Omnibus. It was one of many surveys we launched over the last year. The benefit of surveys are many. You can be double blind. So the people who took this survey had no idea that it was for GE. And that meant that we actually could get a much wider audience coming in to validate not just existing users of GE products. And we used a third-party recruitment firm focused on medical. So we triple validated that we were getting the right audience, and we had some screener questions as well to just triple confirm that we were getting the right medical specialty with the right focus in ways, again, at this scale that you would never have been able to get if you had taken this as a qualitative exercise with user interviews. So we had over 100 participants in this one survey, 50 plus minutes for each. We are able to actually test 90 features across this one initiative, which is a much larger sample size than you would ever be able to realistically do using just qualitative in-person methods. And the nice thing is, when you use a survey, yes, there's obviously still analysis to be done, but there's also like a lot of auto-generated analysis by the system that can give you nice graphs and charts, etc. So you can get much more structured data right off the bat before you invest time in the analysis. So here are some examples of the kinds of questions we were able to ask, which really ran the gamut from discovery to evaluative, quant and qual, all in the same survey, mixed. So, for example, a classic thing you might want to do at the evaluative step is you might have, let's say, 3 design options to solve a given problem. Maybe you have a certain user flow and you could do it A, B, or C way, or you have a certain feature or layout and you could do it A, B, or C way, and you have the designs ready to go. And historically, you might show those to users, whether it's hallway or more structured, to get feedback on which they prefer. Maybe you do a timed test on which is the fastest, etc. Well, guess what? You can do the same things online, and you can even do same things in a survey. It's just people don't normally do it that way. So we would show them 3 ways to 3 designs in this example. And ask them to choose which one they preferred to execute that specific task in that specific context. And remember, we had already screened to make sure we were getting the exact right people who were going to use this software all day long as part of their job. So they understood intuitively what they were looking at. And you can see we got very, very clear data on which one would win. Similarly, in this particular example, the software product had a lot of data fields related to the patient. Well, there are all kinds of people across healthcare that thought they might want to have this or that extra piece of data. How do we validate which pieces of data we actually need to show? Well, we asked users, we gave them a big long list of data, and it was randomized, and they needed to choose which data fields they wanted to have in that interface. And then next question that followed on was, of the ones that you chose, what is your priority and what sequence? So we got very clear answers, as you can see on the right, on which data fields to include and in what sequence. Unambiguous when you have 100 users taking that from across the globe or the country, giving you that input. Same thing with classic kind of upfront question, right? How often do you perform XYZ task? And historically, as we all know, this is kind of question that's really subject to a lot of bias. What people think they do and what they actually do is often not accurate. But we followed it up with a question on how you're actually going to perform that task and in what context, which gave us the context of use to be able to really validate and vet their initial answer. If we think about icons, what we would do is we would show them, for example, an icon in a menu. Okay, now when you see this icon, what do you think it represents? Well, then people would answer with what they think the icon would be. The inverse question would also be asked. If you have a certain functionality, which of these icons best represents that functionality? Two more examples here. So, and then I'll be wrapping. So one of the questions then was about, for example, how to do a user flow. A lot of people say, oh, you can't do interaction evaluation online with the survey. Well, guess what we did? We used animated GIFs to show a user flow or sequence. And we did the same approach where we said basically, which process would you be most likely to use, showing an animation of the sequence to accomplish a task. An example of this would be, saving, right? You can do Command S, you can go File, Save. Which one are you most likely to use and in what context of use? You can show that through interactivity, and you can put it in a survey. Here was one last point I want to make, which is that the other part of this is that we were able to get micro-segmentation by persona. So we had actually 4 different demographic groups taking this survey. They were all radiology subspecialties. And as you can see by the colors on the right, we were able to get nuanced data automatically aggregated by persona for some of these tasks, which was fantastic. So going back to this, basically surveys helped get data from every single quadrant. You can even do timed tests online, which gets you the lower right. So surveys helped us get beyond COVID in a meaningful way by bringing in robust qual and quant data at a much larger sample size than we were ever able to get based on our previous methods. So to recap, most of us don't have money to burn and an army of developers. We need to change the model that the industry is using and that researchers are using to focus on a 4-step approach to how we're building in UX and research into the software development lifecycle, which starts with learning, validating, building, and measuring. And as part of that, we have to cover both quant and qual because they really cover and answer different questions. One's on the user, one's on the business. And really the focus that I'd like to impart is this matrix. Bring in quant and qual in both discovery and evaluative. You always need a mix, and you need a mix at every step of the game. And there are lots of methods that are going to support this that you can have at your toolkit. You shouldn't just be using 1 or 2 methods. COVID made this really difficult for us at GE Healthcare because most of the methods that we liked to use, we didn't have in our toolkit. but surveys helped us make it possible. And that was one of our secret weapons that allowed us to continue our work. So if you'd like to learn more about any of these methods or multiple approaches to testing, I always like to recommend Tomer Sharon's book, Validating Product Ideas. I think it's one of the best out there in the industry. So that's what I had to share. It's about how we optimize healthcare user research at GE Healthcare, especially over the last year. And thankfully, I see Jenny has asked a question, so I do appreciate that.
Okay, let me read out the question. So Jenny's question is, in what scenarios do you think it makes more sense or less sense to involve an external research provider?
Yes, well, I think in the healthcare context, it's kind of essential to use a third-party recruitment firm. We would rely on them heavily at GE Healthcare. Otherwise, you're just limited to whatever user base you have access to. And given the Sunshine Act and restrictions at GE Healthcare, where we really would heavily emphasize separating research efforts for unreleased products from our customer base for obvious reasons, an external research firm really helps solve that problem. They can give you the right group as long as they're a qualified one for the right medical context and help eliminate, any of that kind of bias or nuance. So I think that they're actually, pretty essential in a healthcare context.
Super. Okay, thank you for that. Thank you so much, Beverly. I really appreciate it. We'll just wait for a couple of seconds if anybody else has a question. What about that one-man team that's working on his or her own as a UX everything in the company? Where do they start with the research? I mean, what sort of advice could you give them?
Yeah, well, I'm going to bring up Tomer Sharon's book again. The whole idea of lean, whether it's lean startup, which obviously is intended for startups, or some of the lean UX books, or in this case, Tomer's lean user research, is really how do you validate and execute research in a startup context, which means resource constrained. So a lot of these learnings, there's nothing on this that inherently requires necessarily a large team, except for there is, time and effort involved. Yeah. So if you can learn the basics of how to do these methods, a one-person unicorn can do them just as well as a team. You just have to need to sort of plan for it. And what I like to always challenge my team on is not minimum viable product, which is, maybe not outside our scope, but minimum viable research. So yeah. What is the minimum amount of research you need to answer the question you're trying to answer, and be clear going in on what the question is that you're trying to validate.
Fantastic answer. Okay. Well, let's wrap it up. Thank you so much, Beverly. I really appreciate your time and effort. Fantastic talk. But thank you for waking up early and doing this talk with us. We appreciate it.
No problem. Okay. Thank you.